Um, think about human connection for a second. Think about it as like a financial transaction. Usually we assume it operates like a simple, straightforward exchange of currency.
Right.
Yeah,
Like buying something at a store.
exactly. You share a personal fact about your weekend. You hand over $1. You share a deep, dark secret about your childhood. You hand over a $100 bill. And the working assumption for you, the listener, and really for all of us, is that if you just deposit enough personal data into the interaction, you automatically purchase closeness.
It is a very comforting assumption, honestly. I mean, it implies that trust can just be manufactured on demand. As long as you are willing to pay the cost of disclosure, it basically treats vulnerability like a vending machine. Put the trauma in, get the intimacy out.
Yeah. But our source text for today's deep dive completely shatters that model. It looks at our current social landscape, which is, let's be real, arguably the most overshared publicly confessional era in human history, and it calls the entire thing a counterfeit economy. We are spending monopoly money and wondering why we feel spiritually bankrupt.
And that brings us to the core diagnosis we are unpacking today. The whole text really hinges on a single, hauntingly specific claim from the author. Quote, "I like speaking with those who are vulnerable, for which there are none." Unquote.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because, for which there are none. Zero. If you or I were making that observation at a dinner party, we would almost certainly hedge, right?
No, absolutely. We'd soften it.
Right. We would say, true vulnerability is rare, or it's hard to find genuine people. Claiming a literal null result like none feels incredibly jarring, especially when you can't scroll the internet for 5 minutes without hitting some raw emotional confessional post or a tearful video.
Yeah, but the tension between that constant public performance of emotion and the actual null result is exactly what we need to pull apart. The author isn't throwing their hands up in despair here or just cynically calling everyone fake. This is a precise structural diagnosis.
Right.
We are living in a culture that has become completely fluent in the language of vulnerability, but without retaining any of the actual underlying capacity for it.
So let's look at how that actually plays out in the wild. Because the imitation is so good, it easily passes for the real thing. I am thinking of situations, and I am sure you listening have experienced this, where you meet someone, and within 20 minutes, they are narrating their entire trauma history to you.
Oh yeah, the classic trauma dump.
Exactly. And on paper, that looks like the ultimate dropping of the guard, right?
Yeah.
But strangely, you walk away feeling entirely disconnected from them, almost like you were just a prop in their play. But wait, let me push back for a second.
Go for it.
If someone is giving me all this deeply personal information, if they are literally crying in front of me, how is that not vulnerable? Isn't that the literal definition of letting your guard down?
Well, what's fascinating here is how the text explains the concept of the counterfeit economy. Sharing facts, even incredibly painful ones, isn't vulnerability if it's being used as a control mechanism.
A control mechanism.
Right. Volume of personal information does not equal vulnerability. When someone hands you their deepest trauma within minutes of meeting, they are often just dictating a script.
Wow. Okay.
The subtext of the counterfeit is basically, here is my wound. You may not question it, you may not touch it, and you must react to it in the exact pre-approved manner I am implicitly demanding.
So it is using a heavy disclosure just to manage the room. The pain becomes a moat. Like they are showing you the water, but they are absolutely making sure you stay on the other side of it.
Yes, because true vulnerability is defined by risk. It is the act of handing someone else something that genuinely matters and then actually waiting to see what they do with it. You don't know if they will drop it. You don't know if their response will hurt or help.
You're opening it up.
Exactly.
Look.
You are opening the interaction up to the unknown. The counterfeit version closes the interaction down to maintain safety.
So the counterfeit is like handing a co-actor a script and telling them, I cry on page 2, and you say, I am so sorry on page 3. Whereas real vulnerability is true improv. You step onto the stage, offer a line, and you actually have to see what the other person does. You have to risk being altered by it.
And that risk of being altered is terrifying, which is why we have collectively engineered ways to avoid it while still appearing brave.
Mm-hmm.
The source text actually uses a brilliant phrase for this. It calls it a vocabulary outrunning its referent.
A vocabulary outrunning its referent.
Oh, man.
Yeah, it's such a good line.
It is. Because we all acquired the terminology. The internet basically democratized therapy speak for everyone. Now everybody knows how to use words like holding space or triggered, narcissist, boundaries.
Right. We learned the dialect, but we lost the substance the words were originally built to describe.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to be clear, People are not necessarily being malicious when they do this.
Sure, yeah. They are simply utilizing the tools their culture gave them. We reward visible public processing. We applaud the raw post. So we train people to perform openness, but we never train them to tolerate the actual physiological risk of an unscripted exchange.
So if the words have been completely hijacked as a defense mechanism, we are essentially flying blind. We have no reliable metric for trust if we are just listening to what people say. Someone can literally say, I'm being so open with you right now while entirely managing the interaction. How are we supposed to navigate that?
Well, by stopping our reliance on the transcript of the conversation and looking at the body instead, the text introduces this concept called the somatic distinction. Vulnerability is not a conversational topic. It is a physiological state.
State versus topic. Okay, so that means you could be discussing the weather while being completely vulnerable and open to the person across from you. Or you could be discussing your deepest childhood wounds from behind an impenetrable fortress.
Exactly. The content of someone's speech is a terrible proxy for what their nervous system is actually doing. The body is so much harder to fool than the vocabulary. Genuine openness has a distinct, observable physiological signature.
What does that look like?
It's a literal softening. It is a willingness to be interrupted. It's a nervous system that manages to stay online when the conversation touches on something real.
Let's define what it means for the nervous system to stay online in this context. Because usually when we hit a point of friction or a perceived threat in a conversation, our primal reflexes kick in, right? Fight, flight, freeze, or fawning.
Fawning is a critical one to highlight here, especially when discussing counterfeit vulnerability.
Yeah, expand on that.
Fawning is that trauma response where you immediately abandon your own needs, agree with whatever the other person is saying, and make yourself as small and compliant as possible just to appease them.
To keep the peace.
Right, to keep the peace. It looks like a dropping of defenses, but it is actually a desperate survival strategy to avoid conflict. It is not openness at all. It is preemptive surrender.
Okay, so if someone is not fighting, fleeing, freezing, or fawning, if they are actually maintaining that open, softened state, what does the opposite look like? What is the physical signature of the counterfeit?
The text calls the counterfeit a held position, meaning the person delivering the personal story is physically bracing themselves through the disclosure. They are maintaining a rigid posture, essentially standing guard over themselves, even as they appear to be opening up.
Oh, wow. Here's where it gets really interesting. It is like someone standing at their front door holding a massive welcome sign. But if you look closely, their foot is physically jammed against the door frame to keep it from opening.
That is a perfect analogy.
Right. The verbal invitation says come in, but the physiological reality is an absolute refusal to let you cross the threshold.
And recognizing that jammed foot is exactly why the author finds speaking with the truly vulnerable to be functionally impossible most of the time. You are not just listening to a sad story. You are listening for a state change in another human being. And the reality is, most of our daily exchanges never require us to change state. We just trade our preferred scripts.
God, it requires a completely different way of paying attention. We are so conditioned to take words at face value. If someone says they're fine or if they say they're dropping their guard, we just accept the auditory data. We ignore the fact that their shoulders are hiked up to their ears, their breathing is shallow, and their jaw is totally locked.
Which brings us to the inevitable failure mode. Maintaining a genuine physical state of openness is incredibly difficult. So what happens when a person who is locked in that held position is approached even gently and asked to actually drop the script and genuinely reconsider something?
I mean, their nervous system would rebel, right?
Right. It absolutely rebels. It defaults to a specific defense mechanism because the actual risk feels too high. They contract. And this contraction produces what the text brilliantly identifies as petulance, disguised as vulnerability.
The petulance reflex. Okay, let's map out how this happens for the listener.
Yeah.
Say you are in a conversation. You ask a genuine question that challenges the other person's narrative just a little bit, and suddenly the temperature in the room skyrockets.
Right.
They might snap at you, deflect, or immediately start relitigating your tone.
Yeah.
Focusing obsessively on how you asked the question rather than what you asked.
Or they might suddenly play the victim of the exchange, twisting a gentle challenge into this profound offense. This spike in emotional temperature is a fascinating evasion tactic. But defense mechanism is basically forced to make noise, and that noise sounds like irritation, heat, or sudden heavy emotional weight.
And here is the trap. Because there is a sudden influx of emotional intensity and heat, we misinterpret that as depth. We think, oh, they're getting really passionate, they're getting emotional, we are finally getting to the real stuff.
Yes, we constantly associate intense feeling with authenticity. But the text warns us that this specific type of heat isn't moving toward intimacy. It is moving rapidly toward control.
Wow.
Petulance wants to win the interaction. It wants to reclaim the high ground and force you back into reading the lines it wrote for you. True vulnerability, by contrast, is remarkably quiet. It isn't trying to win. It is simply present.
So is vulnerability's evasion, wearing just enough emotional intensity to look like depth from a distance. If you are scanning a room looking for connection, you will bump into all these heated, reactive, emotionally activated people and mistake that activation for openness.
Exactly. It's just a different, louder type of armor. It creates an illusion of a deep exchange while entirely preventing one from happening.
Okay, so let's play this out practically. If someone is bracing themselves, wedging their foot in the door, and contracting into petulance the moment they feel threatened, the intuitive response for anyone who cares about them is to just soften our approach. So what does this all mean for us? Should we just be infinitely gentler with people until their defenses eventually drop?
The author anticipates that exact assumption and tears it down completely. This might honestly be the most counterintuitive insight in the entire text. They state, quote, "Vulnerability without boundary is not openness, it's collapse."
It's collapse. Wow. That completely reframes the entire concept. We usually treat boundaries and vulnerability as opposites, right? Like boundaries keep people out and vulnerability lets them in.
Right. But the text is saying they are absolutely codependent. Without an intact boundary, a person is not actually available for a real exchange. They are simply available for harm.
Oh, that's heavy.
It is. A person who has abandoned their defenses entirely doesn't feel safe. They feel exposed. And because of that, their apparent openness is incredibly unstable. It will inevitably flip, without warning, right back into that petulant, defended posture the moment the environment isn't perfectly managed for them.
Let's connect this back to fawning for a second. If someone cannot say no, their yes means absolutely nothing. It is just compliance. It is self-erasure. There is no actual vulnerability taking place because there is no boundary being risked. You can't invite someone into your house if you don't even have a front door.
That is such a powerful way to visualize it. For softness to carry any real meaning, a necessary fierceness must be present. Vulnerability is not the absence of a guard. It is a guard that is deliberately and knowingly lowered.
Right.
The person lowering it knows they possess the capacity to raise it again. They have the power to protect themselves, and they choose to take the armor off anyway to see what you do. That active choice is what makes the openness trustworthy.
It completely destroys the myth that vulnerability is just about being this soft, defenseless puddle of emotions. True vulnerability actually has a spine. It says, I have the power to shut this down, but I am choosing to stay in this unscripted moment with you.
And now we can circle back to the diagnosis we started with.
For which there are none. After everything we've just discussed, honestly, it makes total sense. When you define the parameters this rigorously, a shifting nervous system that actually stays online, a complete absence of the petulance reflex, an intact boundary, and the genuine willingness to risk an unscripted exchange, it is a phenomenally high bar.
It really is. It requires a psychological infrastructure that almost no one is explicitly taught how to build. I mean, we are taught to perform, we are taught to defend, we're not taught how to deliberately lower an intact boundary.
So the author's claim isn't cynical at all. It is actually a profound form of integrity.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is a refusal to extend credit to a counterfeit, just because the counterfeit happens to be everywhere. It is declining to call fawning or trauma dumping or petulance vulnerability, just because those are the closest available options in the room. Holding that line is an act of deep respect for the real thing.
And there's a hidden hope buried in the starkness of that null result, too. To be able to measure the counterfeit this accurately,
Yeah.
to be able to spot the foot jammed in the door or the vocabulary outrunning the referent, the author must remember what the genuine article actually feels like.
Yes, you cannot recognize an imitation unless you know the original. The standard being applied in this text isn't just some theoretical concept constructed in a lab somewhere. It is remembered. The author has felt it. They've encountered someone, at least once, who dropped the script and stayed in the room.
They experienced it clearly enough to measure everything else against it and find the current economy wanting, which means the real thing does exist. It might be functionally unavailable in our current social architecture, but it is real.
And the goal isn't to lower the bar until more people can clear it. The goal is to keep the bar exactly where it belongs. Name the reality of the counterfeit economy honestly, and cultivate the capacity within yourself so you are ready if and when the real thing actually shows up.
Which leaves every single one of us listening with a pretty massive, unavoidable challenge. It is time to hold the mirror up to our own mechanics. We really have to ask ourselves some uncomfortable questions, like, are you just speaking the dialect of vulnerability when you share something personal? Are you handing the other person a script and using your disclosure to control the temperature of the room?
It really requires interrogating your own nervous system. When someone challenges you gently, do you soften or do you contract into petulance? Are you risking an exchange or are you just managing a threat?
It is not an easy process to begin, but recognizing your own counterfeit habits is the absolute prerequisite for developing the capacity for the real thing. You have to know your foot is jammed in the door before you can choose to move it.
And that requires stepping out of the theoretical and testing it in practice. You cannot just think your way into a new somatic state. You have to experience the friction of doing it differently.
We have mapped out some really dense territory today, from the counterfeit economy and the unsecured loan of trust, all the way to the somatic state, the petulance reflex, and the absolute necessity of a spine to support the softness. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocation, something to actively mull over and experiment with in your own life.
A way to test the boundary and the risk in real time.
Right. We know the counterfeit relies on a script, and the real thing requires the risk of the unknown. We also know you can't be vulnerable if you lack the boundary to say no. So think about an upcoming interaction. If true vulnerability requires an intact boundary and the genuine risk of being changed by someone else's unscripted response, what would happen if, in your very next deep conversation, you completely let go of trying to control the outcome? Notice the moment you want to hand them a script and deliberately choose to just wait and see what they do instead. Who in your life is actually safe enough to be dangerous to your preconceived narratives?